Hey everyone! This video lecture is going to focus on some clinical correlations associated with the endocrine system. And so we're going to dive right in and talk about diabetes mellitus. So I'm sure you've heard of it before. There are actually two kinds of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. And what they have in common is that patients with either type 1 or type 2 tend to have high blood glucose levels. And constant high blood glucose levels can lead to all sorts of problems like diabetic retinopathy, diabetic nephropathy, diabetic neuropathy. So lots of potential issues associated with high blood glucose levels that you're not able to regulate. Now, there are differences between type 1 and type 2 because in type 1, what we see is an inadequate amount of insulin being produced by the pancreas. And so in order for these individuals to live, they are going to require either multiple injections of insulin a day or maybe like an insulin pump that does a constant release. And what we see with type 1 diabetes is that it usually shows up in young people. And actually, it's the rarer form of diabetes. Only about 5 to 10% of diabetic cases are actually type 1 diabetics. The much more common type of diabetes is type 2, which is sometimes considered a lifestyle form of diabetes because it is associated with things like being overweight, and in fact, losing weight and increasing exercise can actually treat type 2 diabetes, but that makes it sound a lot easier than it actually is because there may be a lot of other factors there that, again, we don't always fully understand all of them. But one of the big differences with type 2 is that type 2 diabetics, they produce insulin. Type 1, remember, they're not making enough insulin or any insulin. In type 2, they're making insulin, but the target cells are not responding to the insulin. So we call that insulin resistance. Now, sometimes the treatment is to simply provide more insulin in order to try to get those cells to respond appropriately. But, that may not work. I mean, that's one of the things that can be a little bit challenging with that. And you can see that, again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of complications associated with high blood sugar levels. So it is important to keep those levels down within homeostatic range. And in a clinical practice, you will likely see quite a number of diabetics because we do have I would say we have an epidemic of obesity in the United States. I think that's in line with public health care researchers and their claims. And so with rising obesity rates, we're going to see rising rates of type 2 diabetes. Now, something kind of interesting, right, is that some of the newest pharmacological agents that are on the market include things like Mounjaro, Wegovy, Ozempic, and those are really effective at helping to manage blood glucose levels and helping individuals lose weight, which helps treat type 2 diabetes. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like in public health over the next decade or so. Okay, now something else that we want to understand about the endocrine system and hormones is how they interact. Because recall that the endocrine system works by using hormones as chemical messengers, and those hormones are dumped into the blood supply, which means they end up in all of the extracellular fluids that surround your cells. So that means that there's lots of hormones all floating around in the interstitial fluids around your cells. So the question then becomes, well, how do these hormones interact when you have all these different hormones around? And how do those impact cells? So it turns out that cells can have multiple receptors for different hormones, which means they can get multiple messages at the same time, and how those messages are interpreted can be different. So what we're going to see is that we have four main interactions. We're going to have antagonistic, when they work against each other. We're going to have additive when they work together, permissive where one allows for another to do its job, and integrative as well. And let's take a look at each of these. So in the antagonistic effect, here's our cell. on the cell membrane are two different protein receptors, one for hormone 1 and one for hormone 2, right? And in this case, hormone 1 increases some kind of cellular activity, but hormone 2 is the opposite, or I can't come up with the word. It's antagonistic to hormone 1. It's going to decrease the cellular activity. So a great example of that would be insulin versus glucagon, right? One increases blood sugar levels, one decreases blood sugar levels. Or PTH versus calcitonin. One is going to increase blood calcium levels, one is going to decrease blood calcium levels. So those are antagonistic interactions of two hormones. Now, if they're additive, it means together they will create an even bigger effect. So again, we'd have two protein receptors, but instead of working against each other, they're going to work in harmony to get an even greater effect. So we might also call that a synergistic effect. And we'll see this with the effect of growth hormone and glucocorticoids. So if both growth hormone and glucocorticoids are present in cellular fluids, so they're both able to bind to receptors on the same cell, together they will have a synergistic effect. They will be even more effective at sparing the use of glucose in those cells, which is a key piece of our stress response that we'll talk about. All right. Some hormones are permissive. That means unless the first one binds, the other one can't have any effect at all. So in this case, we're showing how epinephrine changes the rate of cellular consumption only in the presence of thyroid hormone. So the thyroid hormone is the permissive one. And if thyroid hormone is bound to the receptor on the cell, that allows epinephrine to also bind. And then we will have the effect of epinephrine on cellular energy consumption. So thyroid hormone permits it. Without thyroid hormone, epinephrine can't do its job. And then the last one is that integrative effect. So this is similar to the synergistic effect, but instead of having just two hormones that both lead to this exact same thing happening, in an integrative effect, each hormone does its own thing, but the two things that are happening both contribute to a similar goal. So here it would be like calcitriol and PTH. They do different things. Remember, calcitriol is about absorption of calcium in the digestive system, and PTH does a bunch of other things like activating osteoclasts, but together they work to regulate calcium metabolism, right? So they have these different particular jobs, but each job is going to lead to the goal that we want to reach. Okay, another thing to think about, thinking about how hormones interact, is that when we think about blood pressure and volume, those are going to be regulated by multiple endocrine structures. So we are going to need the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, and endocrine cells in the heart and kidney in order to regulate blood pressure and volume. Now, this is a topic that we're going to see across the semester because, of course, we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system. We're going to talk about the urinary system. And so these things are going to come up in multiple ways. But for right now, I just want you to understand that multiple hormones from multiple structures are going to interact to accomplish something and maintain homeostasis. So really quickly, the heart has cells that can release natriuretic peptides when they are stretched. So if blood volume is high, it will stretch the walls of the heart, which will release natriuretic peptides. That will promote sodium and water loss, right? Because if our blood volume is too high, we want to try to get rid of some of the excess water in our blood, and we do that by peeing it out. So we want to not be thirsty. We don't want to keep drinking water if we're trying to get rid of it. And we want to try to inhibit some of the hormones that help us hold on to water. So that would include renin, ADH, and aldosterone. We don't want any of these active since they would help us hold on to water. Also, if we think about erythropoietin and renin, these will be released when blood flow to the kidneys decreases. So up here, our blood volume was high and it was stretching the heart. Now what we're seeing is what happens when the blood volume goes down and we have less blood flow to the kidneys. At that point, we're like, whoa, blood volume's getting low. What can we do to increase that blood volume? Okay, well, that's going to activate that renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone system. These ones up here that we were shutting down because the blood volume was too high. If blood volume is too low, we want to activate the RAS system because that will increase fluid intake and retention and increase blood volume, which will lead to an increase in blood pressure. So this is just a great example of the complexity of hormones and how they can work together to maintain homeostasis. So this is a great image showing what I just talked about, and I'm not even going to dig into it here because I want you to take the time to read through this chart and see if you can take what I just talked about on the previous slide and apply it here. So go ahead and pause this video lecture right here and just walk yourself through this diagram. What was the stimulus for the disruption of homeostasis, and how did we restore homeostasis? That's your beginning and your end. So go ahead and pause, talk yourself through this, and then unpause and we'll keep going. Okay, so hopefully you're feeling pretty good about your skills in understanding negative feedback loops. All right, let's talk about normal growth now. How do hormones influence normal growth? Well, it's actually pretty darn complicated, kind of like what we just saw with the blood pressure and volume. So you can see we've got lots of hormones that are going to play a role in normal growth. We're going to have growth hormone, thyroid hormones, insulin, parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, and reproductive hormones all play a role because we're going to need to do things like alter energy consumption and metabolism in order to grow muscle and bone. In order to grow bone, we're going to need to deposit calcium. So we're going to need to get those hormones involved. And of course, as we are growing and maturing, we're going to need to kick on the reproductive system. So lots of hormones are going to be involved here. But changes in concentration or mix can have impacts. And that's where it gets tricky. And we don't have all of the answers. Lots of answers, but not all of them. Also, one of the things that we know is that the role of hormones changes with age. So for example, in children, when they're growing, growth hormone is really important to cell growth, mitosis, and protein synthesis. But in adults, growth hormone doesn't play much of a role in cell growth or mitosis and protein synthesis. It seems to play much more of a role in maintaining blood glucose levels and your lipid reserves. So, that's interesting too, how the function and impacts of these hormones can change over time as the organism matures and grows up. So this is just a great example of kind of what's happening due to some of these hormones. So you can see like insulin is going to be really important for glucose and amino acids into growing cells because cells that are growing are going to need lots of energy in the form of ATP that they need glucose to make, and they're going to need lots of amino acids to make new cellular structures. You're going to need parathyroid hormone and calcitriol to deposit calciums in order to grow bone. You're going to need thyroid hormones because you need these for normal nervous system development. And of course, we're going to need reproductive hormones in order to grow our ovaries and our testes and have them do all of their functions that we'll talk about in those chapters. Okay, I've been mentioning the stress response for a while now. Here we are. We're going to just touch on it somewhat briefly, but I think it's important for you to know a little bit about stress. So the stress response is the physical or emotional condition that actually threatens our normal homeostatic values. We call it the stress response or the general adaptation syndrome, GAS. You can use whatever term you prefer. There are 3 phases. You want to be able to name the 3 phases: the alarm phase, the resistance phase, and the exhaustion phase. All of them will involve the autonomic nervous system. Remember, that's the one that it's kind of unconscious. You don't have to think about the autonomic nervous system, and also the endocrine system, because the nervous system and the endocrine system work together to coordinate cellular activities and maintain homeostasis. Now, chronic stress can be very damaging to your health. But a little bit of stress, especially the alarm phase, can be actually really helpful and help us perform better. So the key is getting a tricky balance. So the next time you're taking a test and you're feeling very stressed about it, just remind yourself that actually activated adrenal glands is good for me. It makes me think better because it's sending more oxygen and glucose to my brain to allow me to answer these questions. And so instead of being stressed about your stress, be like, cool, this is helping me. And then after the test, be like, it's all over. And now I just need to relax and let it go and shut down this alarm phase and not move into the resistance or exhaustion phase, because that's where the problems start. So let's take a little peek here at these phases. So here's the alarm phase. You might know it as fight or flight. Typically what we're going to see is the sympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system is particularly active. It will stimulate from the hypothalamus, the adrenal gland, to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Also, there's just in general a sympathetic activation. So your heart rate will go up, your breathing rate will increase, your pupils will dilate so you can see better. Think about things that you would need in order to be able to fight or run from something. Those are the things that will be turned on in the alarm phase. We will increase our mental alertness so we can think better. We will mobilize glycogen reserves so that we have plenty of glucose available for our neurons and our muscle cells, whichever one we need most. We're going to increase our sweat gland secretion, maybe to help maintain body temperature. And again, you're going to see a reduction in digestive activity and urine production, not things we need to think about when we're trying to run away from a bear or get a good grade on a test. But we may need increased heart rate and respiratory rate so we can get lots of oxygen to our brain or our muscles. Now, if we enter the alarm phase and exit the alarm phase within a few hours, we're golden. But the problem is if we go over a few hours of the alarm phase, we will enter the resistance phase, and a lot of things are going to happen there. We are actually going to have long-term metabolic adjustments. Now, if we are actually exposed to real stress that requires us to enter the resistance phase, then it's a good thing. It's protective, right? It's trying to keep us alive. The problem is a lot of times the stress that we're experiencing, we don't actually need the resistance phase to keep us alive, right? And the consequences of the resistance phase are kind of negative for our bodies. So one of the things you'll see is that we conserve salt and water, but in order to conserve some salts like sodium and water, we result in an overall loss of potassium. And that's really bad because your heart and your brain cells need potassium. Think about the sodium potassium pump that you learned about in A&P2. So long term, this loss of potassium is not good for your brain cells or your heart cells. You'll also see that we maintain high levels of blood glucose, which we know from talking about diabetes is not good, and it has some negative effects on some of our body parts. And we are also going to release amino acids, for example, from skeletal muscle, which means we are going to lose muscle mass over time. So point being is, while these things might be protective under true stress conditions, if we are in the resistance phase when we don't actually need to be, it is harmful. And eventually we will reach the exhaustion phase where we simply don't have the reserves anymore to maintain this metabolic rate. We are going to be more prone to infections because all of those glucocorticoids, by the way, suppress inflammation, but that also means that our immune response is suppressed. And so we're more likely to get sick if we're exposed to something. We're not going to be able to fight it off as well. Does this sound familiar? Because I bet it does to at least some of you. We may have cardiovascular damage as a result of the ADH and aldosterone-related elevations in blood pressure and blood volume. Like, we've been having really high blood pressure for a while now. This is not good for our heart. Our adrenal cortex just cannot keep producing those glucocorticoids. And so eventually that means our blood glucose levels are also going to fail. And ultimately, we're going to lose our fluid and electrolyte balance, which is also not good for our heart and not good for our brain. So this can be a deadly phase. I mean, this is no joke when we get into the exhaustion phase. So Most of the time, when we're feeling stressed, we are probably in the alarm phase. And as long as we shut that phase down in a relatively short period of time, it's fine. It's normal. The problem is when we maintain those stress levels and shift into the resistance phase and then into the exhaustion phase. That's where it really gets problematic. Okay. Lastly, we want to talk a little bit about some diseases or disorders, is probably a better term, of the endocrine system. A lot of things in the endocrine system or disorders associated with the endocrine system are due either to an overproduction or an underproduction of hormones. Now, what causes that underproduction, which would be hyposecretion, that would be underproduction? It could be a metabolic factor, like you're not able to make it. For example, you could develop a thyroid goiter if you don't have iodine in your diet. So without iodine, you can't make T3 and T4 thyroid hormones, and then that leads to thyroid problems. It could be that you have some kind of physical damage. So either the circulatory system or the cells that actually produce the hormone are damaged in a way that they're not able, and that results in underproduction, or a congenital disorder. So there may be a problem where a gland is too small, or the enzymes that are being made are defective in some way and not able to function, maybe due to a mutation in a gene. Or maybe you have glands that don't, or cells that don't have the correct receptor in order to be able to bond and respond to hormones in an appropriate way. So different, all of those, they're very different causes, but they all result in an under secretion or an underproduction of hormone or response to that hormone. And then, of course, you could have hypersecretion as well. So let's just take a look at this chart. You have a much prettier chart in your book, by the way. Like, these numbers are falling off over here. I'm not sure what's happening. Your chart is much prettier. It is in module 16.18 in your book. But just to give you an example, like if we look at growth hormone, if you have underproduction of growth hormone, then you would expect to have delayed growth. Whereas if you have overproduction of growth hormone, you might have gigantism or acromegaly. Gigantism is when you're producing too much growth hormone, like for all the time from when you were a kid and you never stop producing too much. Acromegaly is when you produce too much growth hormone after puberty, and so it results in like a thickening of the jaw, for example. If you have hypothyroidism, so you're not making enough thyroid hormones, you're going to have a low metabolic rate. Hyperthyroidism, on the other hand, you're producing too much. Also, another disorder is Graves' disease, which is also connected to overproduction of thyroid hormone. We talked about parathyroid hormone with blood calcium levels. Obviously, if you aren't making enough, that's going to lead to things like muscular weakness due to low blood calcium levels. If you're making too much, you're going to have really high blood calcium levels, which can lead to weak, brittle bones because you're not depositing enough calcium in them. Insulin and glucagon we talked about, so I'll leave those there. But here's those glucocorticoids, and that's kind of interesting because there's two diseases that are kind of the opposite of each other. There's Addison's disease, which is when you have an underproduction of glucocorticoids, versus Cushing's disease, which is when you have too much production of glucocorticoids. And so you can see that in Addison's disease, they really can't tolerate stress because they have a struggle mobilizing energy reserves and maintaining normal blood glucose levels. In Cushing's disease, they also have impaired glucose metabolism, but they're also going to have an excessive breakdown of tissue proteins and lipid reserves. So with Cushing's, we tend to see that people accumulate fat kind of in funny places, like in the cheeks and the base of the neck, so it kind of makes their face a very unique shape, which often gives it away a little bit. And in Addison's disease, one of the things that can be a hallmark is that the melanocytes actually become stimulated, and so you have excess pigment in the skin. So just some interesting things from a clinical point of view. And then you could also look at the effects of like estrogens and androgens. And, if you have too much estrogen or too little androgen or testosterone, depending. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the reproductive unit or reproductive chapters. All right. And that's it for our clinical connections.